work with a lot of entrepreneurs. I work with a lot of individuals going, building deals in real estate, corporate entities. And so I guess one of my specialties is helping individuals find the best business structure for their particular business. So like you said, we'll just roll right into the presentation. Today I wanted to talk about, and it's a very lengthy title, the best business structure for your startup, what to consider when starting your business. So the focus of this is to provide a bit of a background on the business structures that are out there, and a little bit of pros and cons to each of these structures, as well as kind of ending with what is the most common structure for entrepreneurs, which is kind of the audience for this particular presentation. So of course, this presentation wouldn't be complete without a legal disclaimer. This is for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing said here is legal advice. So let's get started in it. Again, kind of talking about my background, been practicing since 2015. I have worked for real estate syndicators. I've worked in-house. I've worked for law firms. A lot of the work that I've done is outside general counsel, entity formation, business and real estate transactions. I currently operate a fully remote law firm based on 3 principles: quality work, affordability, and efficiency. So the progress of this presentation will go through 5 different steps. I'll talk about generally 4 different kinds of main structures and pros and cons for each one, compliance requirements for each of these business structures, the most common one for entrepreneurs, exit strategies, and then questions. So the first, let's start off with business structures. So there are really 4 main different types of structures, and within those, there's a couple of different substructures. A sole proprietorship, which the individual in the business aren't any different. There's a partnership where there's at least one or there's 2 or more individuals agreeing to enter into a business relationship. And again, similar to the sole proprietorship, the business and the individuals really aren't different. There's no separate legal entity created for this. The third is kind of a hybrid model. It's between a corporation and a partnership. And it has a lot of flexibility like a partnership, and it has a lot of protection that a corporation provides. And the last one is the corporation. And so to speak, corporations are people too. They're a separate legal entity entirely, and the government views them as being an entirely different being than the person itself. So over the next couple of slides, we'll break down each of these, give a little bit more information behind them, and talk about the pros and cons for each one. So as I was just talking about, the sole proprietorship, the owner and the business aren't any different. There's no registration requirement for most states, unless you go ahead and you register your business as a name that is not your own name. And so an example of this would be using a very, juiced up, it's descriptive of selling smoothies versus a business called Anthony Despoto's Smoothie Business. So this type of entity, it's best suited for single owner businesses, because if you added another person, it would become a partnership. Very simple taxes and low risk of lawsuits. So what are some of the pros of them? Again, it's you are the business, you're the only one involved in the business, so you have absolute control. There's pretty much no costs associated with setting up this type of business. What are some of the cons? Because there's no separation between the business and the person, the business owner is responsible for 100% of the liability of the business. And what that means is if the business gets sued for doing something wrong, something terrible happens, breach of contract, anybody that sues you can come after all of your own personal assets. So that's the same. Creditors can go after your own personal assets, residence, car, maybe certain investments that you've put together. What are some of the tax considerations? This is a very simple type of structure. The business itself doesn't have to pay taxes. All of the income that you earn, all the deductions, those just flow through onto your own personal income statement. So it's very simple. Partnership, again, very similar to the sole proprietorship. The only difference is you have 2 or more people, and there are 2 subcategories. There's the general partnership and a limited partnership. General partners, everybody that is a partner is involved in the day-to-day operations. A limited partnership, you have at least one person that's silent. And by silent, I mean, they offer a little bit of money. They're looking for a passive investment. They step into the background. They don't really have any say in the way that the business is operated. So we'll break these down a little bit more. So general partnership, again, 2 or more owners. The owners are liable for all of the debts of the business. This is similar to the sole proprietorship, except, you add 1 or more partners, very simple business. All of the taxes flow through to your personal income statement. And you really want to only use this if the business is at low risk of lawsuits. That liability component is even stronger in this case, because if one of your partners messes up or enters into a deal or breaks a deal, commits fraud, whatever it may be, that can carry across all of the. So let's talk about some of the pros. Partners can generally claim losses and business expenses as personal tax deductions. Again, the income and the losses flow through to your personal income tax statement. You don't have a different schedule in order to operate this business. Simple and inexpensive to create and operate. So there are some cons associated with it, similar to the sole prop, personal liability for all the debts and lawsuits of the business. That includes actions against some of your general partner's actions in the business. And if they break a contract, you're considered joint and severally liable. So they could come after every general partner. And you could sue your own partners to pay a certain portion, but your creditors can come after any individual partner for the full amount of whatever, the lawsuit or the debt is. And that goes to point number 3. Any partner can enter into a transaction for the benefit of the business, and the business is obligated to complete those transactions. They are locked in. And once either a partner withdraws or multiple partners withdraw to where there's only one individual left, you would essentially dissolve the partnership and you can continue to run it as a sole proprietorship, but the partnership dissolves. So tax consequences, pass-through taxation, income deductions, credits all fall onto the personal tax statements of the general partners. So limited partnership, we're talking about the same exact thing as a general partnership, except there is at least 1 or more parties that is silent. And again, they offer, here's an example. They put in $10,000 into the business, and that's pretty much the extent of what they do. So they'll offer the $10,000. This is to be used for the business. I get a certain percentage for offering this money. They have no control over the day-to-day operations. Sometimes they have no voting rights whatsoever. It's really, again, simple taxation principles, but the benefit is you add some people that want to be passive partners. Now, one of the pros associated with the limited partnership is the fact that it's exactly the same as the general partnership, but for the limited partners, there's limitation of liability for what their investment is. If you put $10,000 into the business, unless you start acting as a general partner and being involved in the day-to-day operations, the extent of your liability is going to be that initial investment, that 10,000, or, if you snowball all the income and you keep building money, and you keep it in the company as equity, then they could take whatever you currently have in the company, but that's it. They're not coming after your residence. They're not coming after your car, your investments, or anything like that. All of the cons are the same. General partners are personally liable for the business debts and lawsuits. Creditors can go after any of the general partners to fulfill these debt obligations. And if everybody but one person either dies, withdraws, then the partnership will dissolve. Again, you can continue carrying it on as a sole proprietorship. Okay. Tax considerations, very, very similar. Pass-through taxation, income tax deductions all go to the personal income tax statement. So this is one of the newer entities. This was created early 90s, the limited liability company. And essentially, it's a hybrid of the partnership and the corporation. The owners of the limited liability company are considered members. And the way that this is the most flexible business structure out there. Essentially, all of the members can decide we are going to all act as general partners and be involved in the day-to-day operations. And you would have a member managed LLC. Or what you can do is you can appoint a couple of individuals, one or more, to operate the business operations, and they would be considered managers. And you could typically set out what power managers have, running the day-to-day operations, opening up bank accounts, depositing checks, tax allocations, stuff like that. So what is an LLC? What is it best suited for? These are increasingly more common business structures. They're very simple to create. They're very simple to maintain. And so it's really any sort of business model where it could be one individual or multiple individuals that are seeking very simple taxation and limitation of liability. And I will add a caveat that LLCs cannot be used for every business. There are certain businesses out there, usually in very well-established professions. Attorneys, for one, in California, you cannot be set up as an LLC. You have to be set up as a professional corporation. So that a little caveat on that. So limited liability company pros. Liability is generally limited to the extent of the owner's investment. So how we talked about the limited partner, that essentially carries over to the limited liability company. You have your initial capital contribution, which we call it. You put that as an investment into this company in the hopes that you're going to start a business from it and grow it exponentially. So whatever that initial amount is, and whatever amount is left in the company, that is the extent of your liability as a member. Profits, another pro, profits and losses can be allocated differently than the membership interests. And what that means is you could have an owner that owns 70% of the company, and somebody that owns 30%, and you can have the profit shared 50-50 between the parties. That's, that offers a lot of flexibility about what you can do for these types of businesses. And that's this is part of the reason why we're seeing so many different businesses pop up as LLCs rather than corporations nowadays. And then also limited liability company members can be anyone. Foreign citizens, it could be other LLCs, limited partnerships, individuals, anything. So some of the cons, generally speaking, if you're starting a very new business, it doesn't have any established credit. anybody that you go to get debt financing in or enter into large contracts into, they're going to request that the members or the managers personally guarantee those contracts, those debts. So sometimes in LLC, even though you are protected up to the amount of your investment, other parties are going to require that you yourself personally guarantee some of those debts. And that, you still have limitation of liability from external lawsuits, but as far as maybe some of these contracts or debts are concerned, you may still be personally liable. Additionally, there could be something called alter ego liability, which would make a member or a manager personally liable for some of the acts of an LLC, but these are generally only centered around intentional activities. So if you enter into a contract, take money with no intent to actually fulfill the obligations, that would be fraud. And the courts have essentially set precedent that if you're doing something intentional, or if you're doing fraudulent activity, that you will be held responsible. You are no different than the LLC, and you can be sued. LLCs need to comply with securities laws. This is common for both LLCs and corporations. There are some exemptions. What complying with securities laws means, to give a little bit more of a background, if you want to sell your shares openly to anyone, you would have to register your company, and that would essentially be an initial public offering or a direct listing or over-the-counter kind of trades. And ways to get around this is to sell interest in a certain LLC to somebody you have a pre-existing personal or business relationship with. This is called 25102F as far as California is concerned, and it's a limited offering exemption notice. And that's a lot more information that this is supposed to handle, but that's kind of just a background. So another con, to get back into it, a lot of LLCs are less likely to get funding from a VC as compared to a C Corp. This is changing a little bit, but there's something about a corporate structure in all of the case precedent that VCs or institutional investors like. It's very safe. They understand what they're getting into. They understand the ramifications of it. The last con is some states have publishing requirements for LLCs. It's not very common. As far as I'm aware, I believe it's only New York that requires it, but it's additional costs associated with creating this kind of business. Again, similar to the partnership, similar to the sole proprietorship, all of the income and the losses will carry over to the members' tax returns at the end of the year. The only thing that's different is you do have to pay taxes for your LLC, and you typically have to pay some sort of administrative taxes as well. For California, that would be the FTB tax, and that's $800 a year. All right, now the last business structure with two common types of subcomponents, and I say two common subtypes because there's a bunch of different types of corporations out there. There's the C corporation, the S corporation, there's nonprofits, there's professional corporations, and there's benefit corporations. But we're going to only really be talking about the C Corp and the S Corp today. So the C Corp, to go back to one of the introductory slides, the C Corp is a different legal existence than all the parties that own it. And what I mean by that is essentially the government holds a C Corp as a different being, and the shareholders as different beings. So the C Corp is owned by shareholders. The shareholders typically elect a board of directors. The board of directors typically elect officers. And this happens most of the time on an annual basis. But what that does is it creates a lot of procedures on how to operate the business. You're dividing powers of how to operate the business between different parties. So the board of directors operate at the very high level. They're trying to take your business. They're trying to establish the business plans and the growth. The officers are essentially the soldiers that operate the day-to-day operations, and the shareholders get to pick, again, on either an annual basis. Sometimes they have rolling kind of elections. They get to pick who they want to lead them at the very top level. So go back real quick. C Corps are typically, they're best suited for single and multiple owner businesses, limited liability, established procedures for operation. This type of entity is taxed separately, and we'll get into that in a second. It's taxed separately. And if they want to pay, if the corporation ends up paying out its shareholders, then essentially what it does is it issues a dividend. And if anybody's owned stock, you own, one of 10 million shares, and you get 1/10 millionth of the profits from the last quarter, if that's what they want to issue out. So what are some of the pros? Limited liability for the business debts or lawsuits. Generally, the contracts are entered into with the corporation, but if it's a new corporation, sometimes your debtors are going to, or your creditors are going to require that you sign a personal guarantee, whether that's a board of director, officer, shareholder. Now, if a third party, somebody that you're providing service to, decides to sue you, typically they can only sue the corporation itself. But there is something called piercing the corporate veil. And this is very similar to what the alter ego liability is that I talked about with the LLCs. But if certain actions are undertaken where a judge or a jury essentially determine that the business is no different than the person, in which case, you're using the same bank account to pay your rent, to buy yourself a car, then the judge or jury in that situation is going to say, okay, you are the same, and you're going to be responsible for this lawsuit for these debts. So to the second point, lawsuits are typically brought against the corporation rather than the owners or officers, except in that very limited circumstance. And this is very limited. It tends to be fraud, embezzlement, intentional acts. And the number one reason people go for C Corps is they're anticipating outside investors, VC funds, institutional investors, of those sorts. Cons, C corporations can be very expensive to create. I believe probably, and there's a wide difference in what's charged. I know some law firms that charge $2,000 flat fee to set up a corporation. I know some law firms that charge $10,000. So there's a very wide variety in what could be potentially charged. They're very expensive to maintain. And part of that happens to be because of some of these administrative burdens. You have to file, and this is also something to touch on a little bit later. There's a lot of compliance costs, meeting minutes, administrative hurdles, making sure you follow the procedures appropriately so that the actions carried out are binding on the company itself. And then last but not least, corporations must comply with securities laws. Once again, that 25102F exemption, personal and business relationships, that can be used and leveraged so that you don't have to pay a lot of money to go ahead and register with these corporations, or even to have to file, say, again, this is probably getting out of it a little bit, but there's additional exemptions where you provide sufficient notice about the associated risks of entering into a security, and those are called private placement memorandums. And as far as legal costs are concerned, you're typically paying $30,000 to $50,000 to put one of these together, sometimes even more. So they can be very expensive when you're looking for funding outside. So C corporations, the corporation itself is taxed. It files its own tax returns. If it wants to share profits that it's earned throughout the year, it pays those out to its shareholders in the means of dividends. And then those shareholders are taxed as income on those dividends, and they have to file their own personal income tax statements as well. Let's see, owners who are also employees pay taxes on their salaries on their individual tax returns as well. Okay, S corporation. It is very similar to a it's very similar to a C corp, but is more limited in scope. It's generally considered a closely held corporation. It's used a lot with very small businesses or family businesses. And the difference between the S corp and the C corp is the S corp allows all of the income generated at the end of the year. It doesn't have to be paid at the corporate tax level, but it carries over onto the shareholders' personal tax returns. So you get all of the benefits of the C corp, the limited liability, the established procedural rules, if that's, that could be a pro or a con. But you get the pass-through taxation. So you don't have to pay income at the corporate tax level and at the personal tax level. You only pay at the personal tax level, and you don't have to pay we call it second taxation or double taxation. So what are the cons? Very limited in scope on who can actually enter into these kinds of corporations. So you can't have more than 100 shareholders. You can only have natural persons as your shareholders. So it can't be other corporations. It can't be multi-member LLCs. Can't be foreign citizens. It has to be other individual owners. So in that situation, you can't get institutional funding if you're an S corp without breaking your S corp tax election. So let's see, it's also expensive like a C corp. It has all the same paperwork as a C corp, except you also have to file a little bit extra additional tax paperwork to the IRS. Again, administrative duties can be burdensome. You have corporate rules, you have issuing stock, electing officers. All of these happen on an annual basis, just like a normal corporation would do. And also corporations comply with securities laws, which I think we've hammered on a few different times at this point. The taxation, it carries over all the corporate profits go on to the personal income tax statements. Same with losses. The only difference about this compared to, say, an LLC is that there is not as much flexibility. If you have a certain percentage ownership in this type of corporation, then you're supposed to receive that much loss or profit at the end of the day. Okay, so that is our base knowledge on these 4 different types of legal structures with their substructures. And now I plan on talking a little bit more about what costs are associated with registering and operating these businesses to make sure that they stay in compliance with the law. And there are certain associations, like for California, there's the Secretary of State you need to comply with, and the federal franchise tax board. So let's jump in. Sole proprietorship. This is the most simple business to start. You just pick up whatever business you want to do and you start doing it. You may need permits to do what you're doing, but as far as buying a car and selling it, and now you're a car flipper, you don't necessarily need to go ahead and register your business. You just start doing it. You don't have any annual reports unless you decide to use a fictitious business name or a DBA. And in that instance, you file it and then you renew it every 5 years. And that was the fictitious business name, the DBA. That was essentially the difference between Juice It Up versus Anthony Despoto Smoothies. So partnerships, the two different types. General partnership pretty much has no requirements to start the business and no annual requirements. Although there are certain states that require you to at least provide them with notice. That's not very common. So you don't have to pay any annual fees or taxes to maintain that business in good standing. Now, limited partnership, because the state that you're working in wants to essentially know who is the limited partner, then you have a registration requirement for most LPs, and you typically have a tax associated with it, whether it's administrative tax or not. And that would be, for California, that's an $800 FTB tax. For Delaware, that would be like a $300 administrative tax. Limited liability companies, every state that you do business in, you're obligated to register with that state. And if you're headquartered in another state, then you register as a foreign authority in that state. So if you register in Delaware and you decide to do business in California, then you register as a foreign authority in California. And what does doing business mean? It essentially means more than doing some business. It's you're deliberately trying to do business in the state. And that might mean you have employees in the state, you have offices in the state, you intentionally market to the state, you do a certain amount of business in the state. Every state's different. They have their own rules, they have their own exceptions to what is considered doing business. But it's very clear that most states want you to register and pay some sort of tax for doing business in the state. In California, you file a biannual report, and you list who are the managers or members associated with the business, as well as who's your agent for service and process, or who receives the mail in case you get sued. You pay taxes annually. Again, California, this is the FTB tax, $800 a year. Delaware, $300. You want to make sure, so this is part of the compliance process. You want to make sure you have a different bank account for that business. And it's not a requirement, but if you don't want the alter ego liability lawsuit from taking place, which would happen very easily if you just start depositing a bunch of LLC checks into your own personal bank account, you should make sure to have a different bank account to keep those assets separate. Okay. Now the LLCs are very flexible. They don't have as formal of a structure as the corporations, but what you do, you don't necessarily need to have annual meeting minutes. You probably will anyways. And you'll have multiple meetings every year. So there's no requirement to have annual meeting minutes. But if you do have meetings with the managers and the members, just take notes of it. Make sure that you're acting as though you're a business rather than the business is just kind of a name that you yourself are doing business under. Corporations, again, the most formal of all business structures. It has the most onerous requirements. You have to have meetings every year with the shareholders and the directors. You're required to register in every state you're doing business. You pay annual taxes. You file annual reports. Again, no requirement to maintain a different bank account, but it is recommended because you're going to probably have difficulties in cashing checks, unless you just depositing checks and credit and all that. But it also is for the purpose of piercing the corporate veil. If you start using some of those corporation funds for your own personal use, you could be charged as no different than the business itself. Your creditors can try to come after your own personal assets. Okay, so all of this backgrounds to try to tell you what different types of structures are out there, why people would decide to use one over another, pros, cons, and the different tax principles with each, as well as what you need to do to make sure you're complying with certain regulations to maintain your business. So what structure is the most common for entrepreneurs? Generally speaking, most entrepreneurs I know, they're looking for VC funding or they're looking for institutional investment. And because of that, they want to likely use the Delaware CCorp. Now, why specifically the Delaware CCorp? It's, let me see. Specifically because Delaware law is very pro-business. They have certain courts for the corporate environment that will side most often with directors and officers, and special judges appointed to those courts that specifically hear these corporate and business matters. So what you do is you get highly educated individuals that know this very particular set of law, and they have expedited proceedings because they have only these type of corporate matters before them. Tax benefits, if you register in Delaware, but you work outside of the state, all of your business is conducted outside of the state, you don't pay state income tax to Delaware. In privacy is another big one. I'm seeing a lot more of it. A lot of individuals want to create Delaware structures, whether it's an LLC or a corporation, even if they're not doing business in the state, because Delaware does not require disclosure of who your directors or your officers are. In California, in most other states, that's very much a requirement to say, this is your board of directors. These are the officers of the business. These are your members, managers, whatever it may be. So why would it be a Delaware CCorp over an SCorp? If you remember, the SCorp has those better tax principles where it just carries over and you can miss out on the double taxation. A lot of the times it's because you're institutional investors or corporations. They're funds. They are large businesses that have a wealth of experience and money to offer. And the SCorp status is to be used for closely held corporations. And so the IRS really limits you. So another reason is the owners of the SCorp have to be citizens. So you see a lot of foreign nationals that want to start businesses in the United States. They might be here on visas. They're allowed to be shareholders in a CCorp, but they aren't in an SCorp. One last reason, which is a pretty big reason, is there's only one class of stock allowed in an SCorp. In a CCorp, you could have multiple classes. So you could have preferred. In the CCorp, you could have the preferred shares and your common shares that create liquidity preference, that create more votes per share compared to common stock, higher dividends, all those, which an institutional investor or VC is going to want to make sure they're recuperating their capital back as soon as possible. Now, that being said, this is the common road taken by entrepreneurs, but it's not the only road. There are a lot of individuals that don't even know how to start their business. So they start it, and they might start as a sole prop. They might start as a partnership. They might start as an LLC and decide we want to go bigger than what we're currently doing. And so we're going to just start the business, and we're going to convert it to a different business or we're going to convert it to a different structure in the future. And so you could have a California LLC and convert it to a Delaware CCorp. You're going to have to pay an attorney. Well, you don't have to pay one, but it's very helpful to pay an attorney to make sure that the process goes smoothly. So sometimes it's more helpful to just start the business, see if it's viable. If it's not, you can abandon it, rather than we're going to pay an attorney, $10,000 to set up our company, 50,000 to put together a PPM so we can get fundraising. We go raise all these funds, and then we find out within a year and a half that, we can't even do this business. So that's just another option. Again, this is kind of the route that is typically taken. It's not the only route that needs to be taken. Exit strategies, typically three main ones. The C Corp is really desirable because you can do the IPO direct listing. Some people decide to build their business just to be acquired in the future. That's common to be bought out by Google or Amazon. If you can create certain product or service that's really unique. And the last one is the long-term hold and operation. This is where I see a lot of the LLCs that are created today. They're trying to form a business that they can pass down for future generations. And so this would be very common for those multi-member LLCs or just LLCs in general. So kind of to wrap up a little bit, there's a lot of business structures out there. You should probably, if you're interested in starting a business, just go have a free quick consultation with an attorney or a CPA about what works for you. Sometimes it just makes sense to get started rather than working through all of these procedural issues, but that's something that you should discuss and make sure is something that you should be doing. And also remember that this is very basic information. Talk to an attorney, again, a CPA, if you have very specific questions. But I welcome any questions on the topic. I know we have a limited audience, but I'm happy to answer what I can.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. This is really good. I really liked all the tidbits that you indicated, including, how to get started in terms of, maybe this might not be the right route, but, you can get started, really understanding the business before actually transitioning into the different structures. I thought that was really helpful.
Great.
Did we have your contact information up too?
Here, I threw a business card.
Hey, Anthony, I have a question.
Yes, sir.